In the early 5th century, long before stone keeps crowned the hills of Iberia, and long before minarets traced the skylines of its cities, the peninsula still belonged, at least in memory, to the Roman world. Ancient roads continued to wind across valleys and mountains, laid down by hands that had long since turned to dust. Aqueducts still carried water into quiet towns. Latin lingered in courts, markets, and churches. Life, on the surface, appeared unchanged. Yet the empire that had shaped this land was no longer whole. Rome had grown vast, and in that vastness, its strength had thinned. Armies once stationed at every frontier were drawn away. Officials who once ruled with confidence now governed in isolation. Messages still traveled, but not always reliably. Orders still arrived, but often too late. In Hispania, the governors began to sense what no decree would openly admit. They were alone. Power drifted inward. Cities learned to rely on themselves. Landowners fortified estates. The authority of distant emperors faded into ceremony, while real decisions were made quietly, close to home. Change came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow loosening. Then, in the year 409, that quiet unraveling became visible. Across the Pyrenees arrived new peoples, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, drawn westward by forces far beyond Iberia's horizon. They did not march as conquerors in shining armor. They moved as migrating nations, carrying families, traditions, and the urgent need for land. The defenses of Roman Spain, hollowed by decades of neglect, offered little resistance. Within a few years, Hispania became a patchwork. The Suebi settled in the green northwest. The Vandals claimed wide southern stretches. The Alans spread across the central plateau. In some cities, Roman officials still presided. In others, authority dissolved into negotiation. The peninsula entered an age without a single center. And yet, even as it fractured, a new order was already forming. They were called the Visigoths. Unlike the others, they arrived not simply as wanderers, but as nominal allies of a fading empire. Rome, unable to defend its western provinces, had entrusted them with restoration. They spoke in the language of Roman command. They fought in Roman style. Their purpose was not to erase the imperial world, but to succeed it. Through disciplined campaigns, they drove the Vandals toward Africa. The Alans were broken apart, their identity slowly absorbed into larger peoples. The Suebi were confined to the far northwest. By the middle of the 6th century, the Visigoths stood as the peninsula's dominant power. Yet this was not a conquest that swept everything away. Roman villas became Gothic estates. Roman law continued to govern Roman subjects. Gothic warriors received land through a system that divided property without destroying it. Latin remained the language of administration. Bishops continued to guide their congregations. Two worlds overlapped. From this quiet fusion emerged a kingdom centered on Toledo, a city chosen not for grandeur but for position. Roads radiated outward in every direction. From there, a king could reach every corner of Iberia. Visigothic rule followed an ancient custom. Kings were chosen, not inherited. In theory, this ensured capable leadership. In practice, each succession opened a space for ambition. Every reign carried the weight of uncertainty. For a time, the kingdom endured. Its most profound transformation came not through war, but through belief. The Visigoths followed a form of Christianity rejected by Rome. Their subjects were Catholic. Two peoples shared one land, but not one faith. In 587, King Record chose unity. He embraced Catholicism. His decision rippled outward. Church councils gathered in Toledo. Bishops and nobles debated doctrine, law, and royal authority together. Gothic and Roman identities began to soften into something shared. From this emerged one of early medieval Europe's most sophisticated legal traditions, a single code for all peoples. For a moment, stability seemed possible. But beneath the surface, the old tensions remained. Nobles commanded armies that answered to them first. Rivalries persisted. Authority depended not on institutions, but on fragile loyalties. And all human arrangements are temporary. By the early 8th century, Spain appeared whole, yet inwardly divided. Succession disputes weakened trust. Border wars drained resources. The kingdom stood intact in form but uncertain in spirit. Across the narrow waters to the south, another world was watching. In North Africa, Islamic armies had reached the edge of the Atlantic. Their commanders looked north toward the blue silhouette of Iberia and saw a land rich in fields, cities, and divisions. In the year 710, a small force crossed the strait. It was meant only to observe. But history rarely pauses where intention ends. As dawn rose over the pale cliffs of Gibraltar, the Visigothic age was already beginning to fade. Across the narrow waters that separate Africa from Europe, the world was slowly reshaping itself. Along the southern edge of the Mediterranean, new cities had risen beneath unfamiliar banners. Trade routes shifted. New languages mingled in markets. Armies moved with the steady confidence of a civilization still expanding, not in a single rush, but in measured stages, sometimes through battle, sometimes through treaty, often through careful adaptation. By the early 8th century, Islamic rule had reached the Atlantic coast of North Africa. From the hills above Tangier, the mountains of Iberia could be seen on clear days. They appeared close enough to touch, yet distant enough to belong to another world, blue silhouettes resting on the far horizon. For many years they were only scenery. Gradually, they became possibility. Merchants spoke of Spain's inner divisions. Envoys carried rumors of rival kings and uneasy nobles. Coastal scouts described harbors thinly guarded and fortresses standing in quiet isolation. The land across the strait was not poor. It was not empty. It was simply uncertain. In the year 710, a small expedition crossed the water. Its purpose was modest: to observe, to test, and to return. Led by Tarif ibn Malik, the force left little trace behind. A few villages were visited. Defenses were measured. Then the ships turned back. What returned with them was not treasure. It was clarity. The following spring, a larger group assembled on the African shore. It was not vast by imperial standards, perhaps 7,000 men, but it was disciplined and experienced, shaped by years of movement across distant lands. At its head stood Tariq ibn Ziyad. In April of 711, under a pale sky, the ships reached a rocky promontory rising sharply from the sea. The cliffs offered shelter and watchfulness in equal measure. A base was established quietly among the stone. Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, Gibraltar. There were no grand proclamations, no banners unfurled in triumph. From this place small detachments moved outward, touching roads, bridges, and towns with careful intent. Rather than rushing toward walls, they flowed around them. Messages between Visigothic commanders faltered. Garrisons waited for orders that never came. The old networks of authority stretched thin. To the north, King Roderick learned of the landing while campaigning elsewhere. He turned south, gathering forces as he went. By midsummer, he stood at the head of an army far larger than that which had crossed the sea. The meeting of these two forces unfolded near the river Guadalete. It was not a single moment, but a gradual wearing, days of movement, probing, dust, and heat. Formations advanced and withdrew. Cavalry circled. Infantry held their ground. Then, quietly, parts of the Visigothic line fell away. Whether through rivalry, confusion, or despair, contingents commanded by nobles hostile to Roderick withdrew from the field. Gaps appeared where cohesion had once been. Through these spaces, Muslim cavalry moved with calm precision. The center weakened. Roderick vanished in the confusion. His crown and horse were later recovered, but the king himself passed into silence. With him disappeared the heart of Visigothic command. What followed was not a single collapse but a series of openings. Some cities resisted, others negotiated. Many simply waited, uncertain of who would return to claim authority. Within months, Córdoba fell, then Seville. Then Toledo, the capital itself, opened its gates to a new order. Spain did not burn, it adjusted. Governors replaced kings. Arabic joined Latin in the streets. Churches continued their worship beneath a different sky of power. Fields were still tilled. Markets still opened with the morning light. The peninsula became Al-Andalus. It was no longer a distant province of a fading empire, nor yet the heart of a new one. It became a place between worlds, a land where Roman roads carried Arabic words, where Visigothic memory met Islamic governance. In the far north, beyond the reach of easy cavalry, small pockets of resistance remained. Mountain valleys sheltered those who did not submit. Among them rose a figure named Peleo, whose quiet defiance would one day grow into legend. For now, however, the land rested in transition. Minarets had not yet risen. Palaces had not yet gleamed. The libraries of Córdoba had not yet filled their shelves. Those wonders were still waiting. And as the centuries turned, Iberia prepared slowly, gently, to become one of the great crossroads of the medieval world. The years that followed the crossing were neither chaotic nor hurried. They unfolded with a quiet steadiness as the peninsula learned to breathe within a new order. Roads were repaired, taxes reorganized, governors were appointed. The structures of Roman and Visigothic administration were not swept away. They were repurposed, reshaped, and gently woven into Islamic governance. For many who lived in Iberia, daily life changed less than memory would later suggest. Fields were still planted in spring. Olives were still pressed beneath autumn skies. Bells continued to mark the hours in Christian towns. Jewish communities remained in their quarters, speaking ancient words beneath familiar roofs. What shifted was not the rhythm of life, but the horizon of authority. The land had become Al-Andalus. At first, it was simply a distant province of a vast empire whose heart lay far to the east. Governors were appointed from North Africa. Decisions flowed outward from Damascus. The peninsula's fate was bound to events beyond its mountains and seas, yet distance has a way of shaping destiny. Al-Andalus stood at the edge of the Islamic world. Messages traveled slowly. Reinforcements crossed water. Local commanders learned that survival depended on adaptability more than instruction, and in that space between center and frontier, something new began to grow. In the year 750, far from Iberia, the world of Islam was shaken. The Umayyad dynasty, rulers of the caliphate, fell in a sudden and violent revolution. Their palaces were stormed, their family hunted. A new dynasty, the Abbasids, rose in their place. Almost none escaped. Almost. One young prince fled across deserts and mountains, carried by chance and determination. His name was letter 2BF, a BD Alara letter 1E25MA Macron N. For years, he moved from refuge to refuge, learning the fragile nature of power. His mother's Berber heritage gave him shelter among North African tribes. His lineage gave him a name that still echoed in distant places. From travelers, he learned of Al-Andalus. It was far, it was divided, and it was filled with people who still remembered the Umayyads. In 755, with only a handful of companions, he crossed into Iberia. There were no armies waiting, no throne prepared, only uncertainty and opportunity. Local factions, weary of distant governors and tribal rivalries, began to gather around him. His lineage offered legitimacy. His presence offered direction. Slowly, loyalties shifted. Within a year, he stood near Córdoba at the head of an army formed not by conquest, but by alignment. When the battle ended, Al-Andalus belonged to him. He did not claim the title of caliph. That belonged to rulers far away. Instead, he became emir, a prince in exile who had built a kingdom at the edge of the world. From Córdoba, letter 2bf a bd al-era letter 1e25 macron n, I began to shape a new state. He balanced tribes that distrusted one another. He recruited from Arabs, Berbers, and native Iberians alike. He built a professional administration where loyalty belonged not to lineage, but to stability. And he began to build. Along the banks of the Guadalquivir, Córdoba transformed. Streets widened. Markets grew. Bridges carried caravans across the river. In time, the foundations of a great mosque were laid, its arches rising in quiet rhythm, red and white stone flowing like memory turned into form. The city became a center not only of rule but of culture. Arabic mingled with Latin. Poetry crossed religious boundaries. Scholars traveled from distant lands. Gardens bloomed where old walls had stood. Water flowed through channels designed centuries earlier, now renewed. Al-Andalus was no longer merely a conquered land. It was becoming a world. Beyond the city, the countryside adapted. Farmers learned new irrigation methods. New crops arrived: rice, citrus, sugarcane, subtly reshaping fields and seasons. Hills that had known only grain began to glow with unfamiliar green. Even in the north, where Christian polities endured in the mountains, life continued in quiet negotiation. Borders shifted slowly. Raids came and went, but the land itself remained patient. Time, as it always does, softened edges. By the end of the 8th century, Al-Andalus had become something distinct, neither Roman nor Visigothic, nor simply an extension of the Islamic East. It was Andalusian, a place where civilizations did not replace one another, but overlapped, where memory and invention shared the same streets, where ancient stones learned new languages, and in the gentle unfolding of its days, Iberia began to shine in a way no one at the crossing could have foreseen. In the decades after letter 2bf a bd al-era letter 1e25 macron n established his rule, Al-Andalus settled into itself. What had begun as a frontier province became, slowly and almost without announcement, a homeland. The memory of distant capitals faded. Orders from the east arrived less often. The rhythms of Iberia began to shape governance more than the traditions of Damascus or Baghdad. The peninsula was learning to belong to itself again. From Córdoba, the emirs governed a land that was neither uniform nor simple. Arabs from many tribes lived beside Berbers from the mountains of Africa. Native Iberians, some Christian, some newly converted, worked fields their families had held for generations. Jewish communities carried ancient learning across changing borders. No single identity ruled the land. Instead, it layered. Administration adapted to this complexity. Local judges handled disputes according to community tradition. Taxes were standardized but applied with variation. Cities retained older structures while accepting new ones. The state learned flexibility, and in that flexibility, it endured. This was not a land shaped by a single decree. It was shaped by countless small adjustments. In the countryside, water became destiny. Engineers repaired Roman channels and extended them into new valleys. Canals traced gentle lines across dry earth. Wells were deepened. Reservoirs widened. Where rain had once governed harvests, human planning now guided them. New crops followed. Rice shimmered in shallow fields. Citrus brightened gardens. Sugarcane rose along riverbanks. The seasons of Iberia grew more generous, and with them, the population. Villages expanded. Towns grew outward. Markets filled with unfamiliar colors and scents. The land itself began to change character. In the cities, craft and scholarship intertwined. Leather workers, metal smiths, glassmakers, and weavers refined techniques brought from distant regions. Knowledge traveled alongside goods. Geometry guided architecture. Astronomy shaped calendars. Medicine crossed languages. Córdoba deepened. The great mosque expanded in gentle stages, its arches multiplying like reflections in water. Each addition mirrored the growth of the city itself, unhurried, deliberate, assured. Around it, schools emerged. Libraries gathered manuscripts from across the known world. Travelers spoke of a city where night glowed softly with lamps and learning. Yet Al-Andalus did not exist in stillness. To the north, Christian realms endured in mountains and forests. Their borders shifted slowly like tides against stone. Raids crossed valleys. Captives passed in both directions. Treaties were made, broken, and remade. These frontiers did not burn endlessly. They breathed. In some years, warfare. In others, exchange. Christian merchants traded in Muslim cities. Muslim envoys walked through northern courts. Songs crossed borders before armies did. The peninsula was not divided by a single line. It was braided. Through all this, the emirs maintained balance. They suppressed rebellion when needed. They negotiated when possible. They ruled not as distant emperors, but as stewards of a living, varied land. By the dawn of the 10th century, Al-Andalus stood transformed. It was no longer a refuge for exiles, no longer a distant province. It had become a civilization, a place where ancient stones carried new meaning, where rivers remembered Rome but reflected minarets, where time itself seemed to slow as though history wished to linger. And in that lingering, Córdoba prepared to rise, not merely as a capital, but as one of the great cities of the medieval world. The quiet making was complete. What followed would be splendor. At the edge of the 10th century, Córdoba began to change its rhythm. What had once been a thriving provincial capital grew into something rarer, a city that no longer measured itself against others, but quietly became a measure in its own right. Its streets filled before dawn. Water flowed through channels that murmured beneath bridges and gardens. Lamps glowed in workshops long after sunset. The city did not rush toward greatness. It unfolded into it. When letter 2 BF a BD Al-Ara letter 1 E25 M Macron N Roman 3 assumed power in 912, Al-Andalus stood strong but unsettled. Rebellions lingered in distant valleys. Frontier fortresses tested loyalty. Authority, though present, had not yet become unquestioned. He changed that. With patience rather than haste, he restored order. Strongholds were brought back into alignment. Roads were secured. Governors were reminded that power flowed from Córdoba, not from old rivalries. Over time, resistance softened into acceptance. In 929, he took a step no ruler in Iberia had dared before. He declared himself caliph. The title carried more than prestige. It announced independence from the distant East. It proclaimed Córdoba a center of the Islamic world in its own right, equal to Baghdad and Cairo. With the declaration, the city's horizon widened. Ceremony deepened. Diplomacy expanded. Envoys arrived from Christian kingdoms, from North Africa, from Byzantium itself. They crossed bridges and gardens, moving through courtyards scented with citrus and cedar. witnessing a court that blended discipline with elegance. Beyond the city walls, a new creation rose. Madinat al-Zahra, the radiant city. Terraces were carved into the hillside west of Córdoba. Palaces emerged in layered harmony. Marble halls reflected light across shallow pools. Gardens unfolded in careful geometry, where water moved in quiet channels through shade and sun. This was not merely architecture. It was an idea made visible. The caliphate wished to be seen as enduring, balanced, inevitable. Stone and water spoke that language more gently than any decree. Within Córdoba, learning flourished. Books arrived from every horizon. Scholars translated Greek thought into Arabic, then refined it. Physicians compared observation with tradition. Astronomers charted stars that had guided sailors for centuries. Jurists debated law with subtlety that shaped lives far beyond the city. The great mosque expanded once more, its arches multiplying like steady breath. Its space became both sanctuary and symbol, a gathering place for prayer, reflection, and identity. Yet even in this glow, life remained ordinary. Children walked narrow streets, merchants counted coins, artisans shaped wood and leather. Water carriers called out in the morning light. Gardens bloomed behind modest walls. Greatness and simplicity coexisted. Córdoba did not rise by abandoning daily life. It rose by perfecting it. Travelers carried its image outward, a city where streets were paved and lit, where libraries surpassed palaces, where scholars debated beside fountains. In lands where night still ruled unbroken, the idea of such a place lingered like a half-remembered dream. And beyond the mountains, Christian realms listened. They sent envoys. They sought treaties. They learned. The peninsula remained divided, but it was no longer isolated. It was aware of itself. Córdoba had awakened. And in its quiet brilliance, medieval Spain entered an age the world would remember as golden. For a time, the peninsula seemed to rest within itself. The caliphate's authority reached from the Atlantic coast to the mountain frontiers. Roads remained open. Markets thrived. Ships crossed between Iberia and Africa with steady rhythm. The violence that had once shaped every horizon receded into distance, replaced by patterns of trade, learning, and seasonal labor. This was not an age without conflict, but it was an age in which conflict no longer defined every breath. Under Al-1E25 Roman II, son of Abd al-1E25 Roman III, Córdoba reached a gentle summit. The caliph ruled without urgency, guided more by scholarship than by conquest. His court became a place where power and learning shared the same rooms. He collected books with patient devotion. Caravans arrived bearing manuscripts from Cairo, Baghdad, and distant cities whose names shimmered like poetry. Scribes copied endlessly. Translators worked in quiet chambers, turning Greek philosophy into Arabic, refining it, expanding it. Knowledge flowed through Córdoba like water through its gardens. The city became a library of the world. Mathematics shaped architecture. Medicine became method. Astronomy refined time. Law balanced tradition with reason. Ideas moved across borders more easily than armies. Even beyond Al-Andalus, the light reached outward. Monks in northern monasteries heard of texts preserved in Córdoba. Merchants carried stories of paved streets and night-lit markets. Envoys returned with fragments of thought that would one day reshape distant lands. Within Iberia, cultures brushed gently against one another. Christians lived under Muslim rule as protected communities. They worshipped in familiar churches, spoke evolving dialects of Latin, and gradually absorbed the cadence of Arabic life. Jews served as physicians, diplomats, scholars, and traders, moving between worlds with practiced ease. This coexistence was not perfect. It required negotiation. It required boundaries. It required patience. Yet it endured. The rhythm of life softened. Raids along the northern frontier became seasonal rather than constant. Diplomacy replaced impulse. Time itself seemed slower, as though history paused to admire its own reflection. But beneath this calm, motion continued. Power does not rest. Beyond the caliph's halls, a man named Ibn Abi Amir rose through the administrative ranks. He organized. He coordinated. He learned how systems breathed. He became indispensable. He would be remembered as Al-Andalus letter 1E63 Macron R, the victorious. For now, he worked quietly. And as Córdoba basked in its gentle brilliance, unseen currents began to turn beneath its surface, currents that would soon exchange calm for momentum and contemplation for motion. The golden hour was real, but like all hours, it was already passing. The change did not arrive as a storm. It began as a shift in rhythm. When Al-Letter 1E25 AKM Roman II passed from the world, his son Hisham was still a child. The caliphate, vast and luminous, suddenly rested in small hands. Around him gathered regents, courtiers, and generals, each offering guidance, each holding a piece of power. Among them stood Al-Andalus letter 1E63 Macron R. He did not seize authority in a single gesture. He accumulated it, slowly, methodically. He restructured the court. He reorganized the army. He replaced uncertain loyalties with disciplined systems. The caliph remained, revered and distant, while real command flowed through Al-Andalus letter 1E63 Macron R's hands. Córdoba did not resist. It adapted. Under Al-Andalus letter 1E63 Macron R, the peninsula returned to motion. Armies marched north with renewed regularity. Christian strongholds were tested. Cities were raided. Even Santiago de Compostela, far in the green northwest, felt the echo of Andalusian power. These campaigns were not driven by chaos. They were deliberate. Each expedition reminded the frontier that Córdoba still breathed with strength. Each return brought spoils and stories. Bells from distant cathedrals were carried south and repurposed as symbols of triumph. Yet this energy came at a cost. The army became personal. Loyalty shifted from dynasty to commander. Taxes deepened. Resources bent toward movement rather than reflection. Libraries remained, mosques still glowed, but the balance began to tilt. The caliphate was becoming a machine. When Al-Andalus letter 1E63 Macron R died, his sons inherited his structure, but not his equilibrium. Rivalries hardened. Command fractured. The young caliph remained a symbol without reach. The calm that had defined Córdoba gave way to uncertainty. Courtiers plotted. Governors hesitated. Cities listened for direction that no longer arrived with clarity. Then the unthinkable occurred: civil war. From 1009 onward, Córdoba endured a decade of internal conflict. Palaces were stormed. Caliphs rose and fell. Berber troops marched through streets that once hosted scholars. Fires replaced lamps. The radiant city dimmed. What had taken generations to build unraveled in years. Authority collapsed outward. In Seville, in Zaragoza, in Toledo, in Valencia, local leaders claimed independence. Each declared legitimacy. Each formed a court. Each became a king. The caliphate dissolved into many realms. They were called the taifas. Each taifa shimmered with its own beauty. Poets filled halls. Gardens bloomed. Scholars gathered under new patrons. The art of Al-Andalus did not vanish, it scattered. But unity was gone. Rival kings competed not only in splendor but in survival. They hired mercenaries. They negotiated with Christian rulers. They paid tribute to avoid conquest. Gold flowed north. What had once been a single horizon became a mosaic of fragile crowns. Beyond the mountains, the Christian kingdoms watched. They no longer faced a single power, they faced many, and in that division they saw not danger but opportunity. The age of unity had ended. The age of borders had begun. While Al-Andalus fragmented into rival courts, the mountains of the north continued their quiet work. There, beyond wide plains and easy cavalry routes, valleys folded inward, forests gathered, rivers cut narrow paths between stone. The land itself resisted sudden change. In these places, small Christian realms had endured for centuries. They were not empires, they were not grand, they were patient. Asturias had become Leon. Leon gave rise to Castile. In the east, Navarre and Aragon took form among high passes and watchful ridges. Along the Mediterranean edge, the Counts of Barcelona shaped a coastal power that looked as much toward the sea as toward the land. These kingdoms grew not by sweeping conquest, but by quiet persistence. They fortified hills. They repopulated empty valleys. They granted land to settlers willing to live close to danger. Stone by stone, they pressed southward. For generations, the Christian North had known itself as surviving at the edge of something larger. Now, for the first time in centuries, the balance shifted. The Taifas were wealthy. Their cities gleamed. Their poets sang, but they stood alone. One by one, their rulers turned northward not with armies but with tribute. Gold crossed mountain passes. Silks and spices followed. In return came promises of peace, alliances, and protection. Christian kings learned patience. They accepted payment instead of battle. They allowed Muslim courts to exist, because living kingdoms paid more than conquered ruins. With this wealth, they strengthened walls, raised armies, and refined administration. The frontier became porous. Muslim architects worked in Christian cities. Christian knights served Muslim rulers. Merchants crossed borders with ease. Even marriages bridged divides. Yet beneath this exchange flowed a quiet certainty. The north was growing. Castile expanded its frontier. Aragon moved along river valleys. Barcelona extended influence inland. Leon fortified the plateau. Each advance was small. Each felt temporary, but together they reshaped the map. In Al-Andalus, Taifa rulers sensed the change. They fortified. They hired mercenaries. They sought allies across the sea. And across the strait in North Africa, new powers were rising, movements shaped by desert winds and austere belief. They listened to Iberian appeals. They saw wealth. They saw division. They saw a land ready for reunification. The northern shadows lengthened. The mountains, once barriers, became gateways, and the peninsula, long braided between worlds, prepared once more for the arrival of forces born beyond its horizon. Beyond the narrow waters of the strait, the desert was stirring. In the wide spaces of North Africa, far from the gardens of Córdoba and the courts of the Taifas, a new movement had taken shape. It was born among tribes accustomed to wind, distance, and restraint. Its leaders spoke of purity, of discipline, of a return to first principles. They believed that faith had softened, that power had grown ornamental, that the world had drifted from its center. They were called the Almoravids. Their strength did not come from splendor, but from cohesion. They trained together. They prayed together. They moved as one body across landscapes others could not endure. Camel-mounted warriors crossed vast distances with little support, appearing where no army was expected. When messengers from Al-Andalus arrived, bearing pleas from anxious Taifa rulers, the Almoravid leader Yusuf ibn Tashfin listened. He did not rush. He sent scouts. He measured the Christian advance. He studied the weakness of divided courts. What he saw was a land rich and uncertain, defended by poets and silver more than by unity. In 1086, Almoravid ships crossed the strait. They did not come as guests. They came as guardians. At Sagrajas near Badajoz, Almoravid forces met the army of Alfonso VI of Castile. The battlefield stretched wide and open beneath autumn light. Christian cavalry charged with familiar confidence. Berber horsemen gave ground, drawing them forward. Then the desert answered. Camel cavalry advanced through dust and sound unfamiliar to European fields. Horses recoiled. Formations loosened. The Almoravid center held firm and the Christian host began to fold. Alfonso survived, wounded, retreating north. The message was unmistakable. The Christian advance could be halted. Across Al-Andalus, hope returned. Yet the Almoravids had not crossed merely to rescue. They had crossed to rule. One by one, Taifa courts were absorbed. Some rulers welcomed protection. Others resisted and were removed. Seville fell. Granada followed. The mosaic of independent kingdoms faded into a single authority. Unity returned, but it returned changed. The Almoravids brought austerity. Courtly excess softened. Religious practice tightened. Poetry quieted. The delicate balance of Al-Andalus shifted toward discipline. For a time, the frontier stabilized. Christian kings paused. Muslim territories regained coherence. Trade resumed under new rules. Yet no order endures unchanged. In the Atlas Mountains, another movement began to grow, one even more radical in belief, more centralized in vision. They called themselves the Almohads, those who proclaim unity. They watched the Almoravids as the Almoravids had watched the Taifas. And once more, Iberia became the far shore of distant transformations. The South had spoken. Soon it would speak again. The return of unity under the Almoravids slowed the northern kingdoms, but it did not stop them. Beyond the rivers and plains, in lands shaped by wind and stone, Christian rulers continued their patient work. They fortified. They settled. They waited. Each generation learned the terrain more deeply. Each frontier town became both shield and seed, defending what lay behind while preparing what lay ahead. The advance did not come as a single tide. It came as footsteps. Castile pressed along the broad plateau, where rivers cut through open land and stone towers rose like quiet sentinels. Aragon followed valleys eastward, learning the rhythm of siege and settlement. Leon guarded the western approaches. Barcelona's counts extended influence inland, blending trade with ambition. Every gain was measured. Every loss was remembered. The borderlands became a world of their own, neither fully Christian nor fully Muslim. Here, cultures overlapped in daily life even as banners opposed one another in war. Farmers tilled fields beneath changing flags. Markets shifted allegiance without moving location. Language bent and blended. Time softened identities. In the 11th century, Toledo fell. Once the Visigothic capital, later a jewel of Al-Andalus, the city stood at the heart of the peninsula. When Alfonso VI entered its gates in 1085, it marked more than a conquest. It was a symbolic turning of the land's axis, a moment when memory and momentum met. Church bells replaced the call to prayer in the great mosque. New settlers arrived, yet much of the city's life continued beneath new authority. Muslim artisans remained, Jewish scholars stayed. The river still flowed beneath its bridges. The land did not vanish. It transformed. The centuries that followed became an age of sieges and settlements. Castles rose along ridges. Charters invited families southward. Monasteries followed armies, carrying records, seeds, and stone. Each conquest was bound not only by force but by repopulation. Christian rulers learned to govern mixed lands. They borrowed methods from those they replaced, tax systems, irrigation practices, even architectural forms. Minarets became bell towers. Courtyards remained courtyards. Gardens endured. The advance was not uniform. Some years brought movement. Others brought pause. Great victories were followed by decades of quiet. Rivers changed hands slowly. Cities endured long before yielding. The land resisted haste. From the south, the Almohads emerged with renewed energy. They reunited Islamic territories and carried reform across Iberia. Their armies met Christian coalitions on wide plains, and for a time the balance held. Then in 1212, near the mountain pass of Las Navas de Tolosa, the rhythm broke. Christian forces gathered from Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and beyond. They crossed difficult terrain, guided by local knowledge and quiet determination. On the open ground beyond the mountains they met Almohad power. The battle was fierce, but its meaning was gentle in the long view. It marked a shift. After Las Navas, the momentum turned, not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but the south began to open. Cities that had resisted for generations now stood exposed. Strongholds fell one by one. Valleys followed rivers. The frontier moved steadily, like a shadow sliding across the land. Córdoba fell in 1236. Its mosque became a cathedral. Its streets learned new processions. Yet its walls remained. Its bridges endured. Its memory lived on in stone and water. Seville followed. Valencia, Murcia. Each carried forward the same pattern: conquest, adaptation, continuity. The Christian kingdoms did not erase Al-Andalus. They absorbed it. The long advance was not a march of destruction. It was a slow weaving of worlds. And as banners changed above towers, the land itself remained, patient, fertile, remembering every language it had ever spoken. By the middle of the 13th century, the shape of Iberia had changed. Where once Al-Andalus stretched in an unbroken arc from sea to sea, now only the southern mountains remained beyond Christian reach. The great cities of the Guadalquivir had passed into new hands. Rivers that had once marked frontiers now flowed quietly through settled kingdoms. What remained of Islamic Spain gathered in the high valleys of the southeast. There, between rugged hills and fertile plains, the Emirate of Granada took form. It was smaller than what had come before, but it was not weak. Sheltered by mountains and sustained by trade across the Mediterranean, Granada became a realm of refinement. Its rulers governed with care, balancing tribute with diplomacy, defense with elegance. Within its walls, art deepened. Palaces rose along terrace slopes. Water flowed through carved channels. Gardens unfolded in layered harmony. The Alhambra grew not as a single monument but as a living complex, courtyards opening into halls, halls into light, light into silence. Granada became a memory made present. It was the last echo of a world that had once filled the peninsula. Beyond its borders, Christian kingdoms matured. Castile and Aragon grew into structured states. Law replaced improvisation. Bureaucracy followed conquest. Cathedrals rose where mosques had stood, yet often upon the same foundations. The land itself taught continuity. Roman roads still guided travelers. Andalusian canals still fed fields. Arabic words lingered in place names and speech. Iberia did not forget its layers. Trade crossed the sea. Genoese merchants anchored in Andalusian ports. Scholars moved between courts. Pilgrims followed ancient paths northward. Ships carried wool, grain, silk, and silver across waters that had never belonged to a single people. The Mediterranean grew smaller. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Maps refined the world. Time shortened distance. Even faith softened at the edges. Christian rulers employed Muslim artisans. Muslim courts preserved classical learning for Christian readers. Jewish scholars moved between traditions, carrying memory in both directions. The peninsula became a bridge. Yet tension endured. Borders were watched. Tribute weighed heavily. Raids still crossed valleys in seasons of strain. Granada survived through balance, by yielding just enough to endure, by standing firm just enough to remain itself. It became a mirror of time, a place where the past still breathed. As centuries turned, medieval Spain approached its horizon. The old rhythms of empire, caliphate, frontier began to slow. The world beyond Iberia was changing as well. New seas were charted, new powers rose, new ambitions stirred. The age that had begun with Roman stone and desert wind was drawing toward its close. The land had been Roman, then Gothic, then Andalusian, now Christian once more, yet never simply so. Each layer remained, each voice lingered. And in that accumulation, Spain became not a single story but a living archive of time. In the final centuries of the Middle Ages, the rhythms of Iberia slowed once more. The great tides of conquest had receded. The land no longer shifted by decades, but by generations. Castile and Aragon stood as mature kingdoms. Their borders were guarded by law as much as by stone. Roads carried merchants more often than armies. Towns governed themselves through charters refined over centuries of frontier life. And in the south, Granada endured. It did not expand. It did not retreat. It remained. Sheltered by mountains and sustained by diplomacy, the Nasrid Emirate became a realm of inward beauty. The Alhambra continued to grow in quiet stages, each courtyard a pause, each arch a breath. Water traced paths through marble, reflecting sky and shadow in equal measure. Granada was not a remnant, it was a culmination. Within its walls, poets still wrote in Arabic. Artisans carved wood and tile with patient precision. Scholars preserved traditions that stretched back to Córdoba and beyond. The city did not cling to power through force, but through balance, through treaties, tribute, and careful restraint. Beyond its borders, Christian Spain matured. Universities rose in Salamanca and elsewhere, shaping new generations. Gothic cathedrals reached toward light. Law codes replaced improvisation. Monarchs learned to rule not merely by inheritance, but by institution. The peninsula's many identities began to draw inward. Castile looked westward toward open seas. Aragon looked eastward across the Mediterranean. Granada looked inward toward memory. The medieval world itself was changing. Ships grew bolder. Maps expanded. Time felt shorter. The horizon that had once ended at the mountains now drifted beyond the ocean's edge. In 1469, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile joined two great crowns. Their union did not immediately alter the land, but it aligned it. Power gathered. In the years that followed, Granada stood as the last chapter of an older story. Its walls still shimmered. Its gardens still whispered. Yet its survival depended on a balance that history no longer favored. When its gates finally opened in 1492, there was no great ruin. There was a ceremony. Keys were handed over. Banners changed. The city passed from one world into another with the same quiet dignity that had shaped Iberia for centuries. The medieval age of Spain ended not in flame, but in transition. The land remained. Rivers still flowed along Roman paths. Fields still followed Andalusian canals. Cities still carried Gothic towers above Islamic stone. Spain did not become something new by forgetting. It became itself by remembering. And as the world turned toward oceans and continents yet unknown, the peninsula rested, layered with empires, kingdoms, faiths, and dreams, holding within its valleys the long echo of every age that had passed across it.